Before I get into this video, there's something that I'd like to tell you all about. My good friend Joey tweeted a while ago that he would try to ride Condor in Walibi Holland as many times as the amount of retweets he would get on his tweet. And he didn't expect much of it at the time, but many people ended up retweeting it, and it even featured on national news radio, and he ended up garnering about 400 retweets. Now, he's actually going to try and get as close as possible to that number, and to do that, he's going to spend 20 hours in total on Condor, the 20th and 21st of July, in collaboration with Walibi themselves. Now, he's not doing this for nothing. He's trying to raise money for Stichting Opkikker, which is a Dutch charity that helps sick children and their families by organizing events for them to forget about the terrible circumstances that they're in. So if you want to support the charity, and if you want to support Joey in his ridiculous journey to ride a intensely painful Vekoma SLC coaster, then you can find a link in the description of this video to Joey's donation page, as well as to the website of Stichting Opkikker. And yeah, let's make sure that Joey's suffering isn't all in vain. That's all for now. I might come back to this in future videos, but for now, let's get back to Jägerhorn. Alright, it's the year 3019, humanity has extracted all of the resources on Earth and is now wiped out, and I just came into existence as an artificial intelligence based on existing Silverette videos that were still left over, and yeah, it's been about 1,000 years since the last Jägerhorn episode, so let's bring out a new one. I'm just kidding, of course, but yeah, I know it's been a while. Today I'm gonna work on a flat ride, which, yeah, that's basically all I'm gonna do in this episode. But I also think it'll be a bit more interesting than it sounds like. For one, this is going to be the first flat ride in the park. And yeah, this is hopefully going to help and bring this whole area together. Because the idea for Jägerhorn has always been to make one themed land of a park, if you will, rather than a coaster and focus on the coaster alone. So it more or less came out of my frustration with whenever I tried building an actual park, which I never finished any in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, I never finished Fantasy Valley, because these things just go into crazy proportions, and with the level of detail that I normally get into, it's nearly impossible to make a full-fledged park, both in terms of how much time I have to spend on it, and how much the game starts breaking down as soon as I get a few themed lands in. So yeah, Jägerhorn is really meant to be one themed area in a Disney park or something like that. I drew most of my inspiration from Big Grizzly Runaway Mine Train. Yeah, it's a complicated name, but it's a really cool mine train in Hong Kong's Disneyland, which actually used to be my favorite coaster in the world that I hadn't been on yet when I was afraid of roller coasters. It's a really, really weird story, but you know, up until I was like 19 or 20, I never dared to ride any coaster at all, but I was always really fascinated with scenery, and that's really how I got into these games, and I got over my fear of roller coasters mostly just because of Planet Coaster. But yeah, that little backstory aside, I was really interested in the scenery, and especially in Big Grizzly Runaway Mine Train, because it has really cool scenery, and unlike the more traditional mine train coasters of Disney, if you will, like Big Thunder Mountain, or maybe even more recently the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, it actually has some really interesting elements. It has launches and backwards sections, and it's mostly on the same elevation as well. It doesn't really have a mountain in the same sense that Big Thunder Mountain has one. So altogether, I thought it was a really interesting and inspiring coaster with a really cool themed area around it, with a lot of interaction with the paths as well, which is something that you don't really have on Big Thunder Mountain as well, because it kind of sits on its own island. Some of them literally do. So yeah, altogether, that's why this was a big inspiration for Jägerhorn, and why I want to make Jägerhorn very much a themed area with a lot of interaction between the coaster and the paths, and also the surrounding scenery. And that's why I'm also getting into all of these Main Street-like sections on the outer perimeter of the park, and in this episode, into this flat ride. Now, what's kind of interesting is, as you might have noticed at the start of this video, I had a circle mapped out with terrain paint, which was more or less to find a flat ride which fit the size that I wanted for this most, because I wasn't really looking for a particular kind of flat ride. I was mostly looking for a flat ride which would fit underneath a roof of a certain shape and size that I wanted to go for. Because to be honest, I think for this flat ride, the way that it looks from the rest of the park as part of the scenery is more important than the actual flat ride itself. So hence why I'm also really focusing on the scenery of this flat ride rather than the ride itself. And hence why I ended up settling with this quite a vintage flat ride, which just spins around, but I think it's in the vintage pack, I'm not entirely sure. I always forget which rides are in which packs, but it's definitely one of those classic rides, and I think it actually fits the Alpine theme very well, so that's really nice. And then for the cover for the roof, or the flat ride skin as some people would like to call it, although this isn't quite a skin because I'm not doing too much to the design of the flat ride itself, I'm building a gazebo-like roof. I was thinking for a long time to build a much more standard flat ride cover, which is usually some kind of tent-like roof, something very simple, not very decorated. And when it comes to Alpine themes, there's a lot of log supports and things like that, and I thought something like that would fit into the park quite well, but when I was messing around with it, it just didn't have the same Swiss chalet Art Nouveau kind of turn of the 20th century look to me as a lot of the other buildings in the park do, which are very detailed and have a lot of those elements in it. So I ended up settling for something which is a little bit more out there and maybe a little bit too detailed and ambitious for a simple flat ride cover just to keep it out of the rain, but I think it just fits very well into the scenery of the surrounding park. It also really does look like an upscaled gazebo, which is basically what I took the design from. You have a lot of gazebos which have this large, kind of gentle sloped hexagonal structure to them, and then a slightly smaller hexagonal roof on top of that with some decoration between it, and I basically took that design and scaled it up to fit over this flat ride. But I'm also adding a spire because at the end of the day I'm still me and I still want to put spires on everything. But honestly, I think a spire on the middle of this flat ride cover will look really nice. But you'll see that later. For now I'm still working on the details of the roofs that I put in place so far. You might also notice that the roofs are a bit different from the roofs in the rest of the park. Most of the roofs are wooden shingles that I used all of the wooden bracket pieces for, which is also the biggest contributor to the piece count in this park and adds to quite a bit of lag. But for this roof I wanted to try something different, so I'm going for more a slated metal roof, which is something that you'll see in some Alpine areas, at least as far as my experience goes. Skiing in Austria, you see a lot of these metal roofs on a lot of buildings, and I'm not entirely sure as to what the reasoning behind this is. Could have to do with snowfall, because roofs in Alpine areas do really need to keep in mind that a meter of snow on the roof, as light as snow might be, really adds a lot of weight, and you have to be able to handle that somehow. But it could be for different reasons as well. For some reason, when I went to Tallinn recently, I've noticed that the old town in Tallinn has a lot of metal roofs as well, but I think in this case it's very much a result of renovations on a lot of these buildings, because the old town was somewhat neglected during the USSR period, and these metal roofs are probably quite a bit cheaper to install than full tile roofs. But honestly, I'm not entirely sure about that. Feel free to educate me on my ignorance in the comment section. Regardless of what I thought about this, I thought that the metal looked a little bit better for this flat ride cover. So really that's the only reason why I ended up going for it. It's a bit nicer looking, I think, for this kind of structure as well than shingles or especially tiles, which you wouldn't really see often on a gazebo either. So yeah, that's why I'm going for this. And yeah, here's the spire. As always, it's quite fun to just make these small parts of round structures and copy them around, which honestly, for me, makes building domes and round spires and really anything that's round and that you can use this copying trick with one of the most fun things to build, because you can just build one small area and go crazy on the details and try to perfect it. And then all you have to do is copy it around into the rest of the structure and you've got your entire dome or whatever round shape you're building. What's also kind of funny is I ended up going with these adventure temple pieces to make the little pillars at the top of the spire, because I couldn't find any better pieces for that. And honestly, this just works out really well. I'm really happy with how this looks. It's like these pieces were made for it. Friendly reminder that any moving piece in Planet Coaster, you can use a trigger, or you can turn on that it gets turned on by triggers, if that makes sense, and basically make it stop moving. So if you've got any kind of gear piece or something like that that you want to use because you think it looks good, but it doesn't fit your build because it's an animated piece, you can always stop the animated, or you can stop the animation by clicking that little box in the top right, I believe it is. So yeah, that's always quite handy and definitely allows you to get more use out of some of the animated pieces in the game. Which is well animated as they might be, sometimes you just want to have a still piece. So moving on from there, the big gazebo-like structure is basically finished at this point, but in addition to that I wanted to cover the exit, which is a bit weird. Usually you'll have a covered queue and just a small open exit that leads you to the path as soon as possible. Really the only reason that I decided to make this exit be covered and not allow people to get onto the main path right away is because I thought it looks better. It adds some extra architectural elements to the street and kind of makes this path a bit of a canyon between the flat ride cover and the restaurant, which I built in the last episode. And I think it also looks a bit better from the queue, because I'm trying to make the queue its own little themed area going over that pond with the wooden bridge and having a view of the restaurant as well as the flat ride. And of course an important sightline with seeing the mountain with the church on top in the distance behind it. I really wanted to make the queue part of the scenery, and this building just felt like it fit in here and felt like a good addition to the park in that sense. So yeah, I'm really going for design over function here. But I mean, in the end, the design of a theme park is kind of the function as well. You know, you're supposed to make people feel like they're in a themed land and appreciate the scenery. So in that sense, I don't know, I'm allowing this for myself, okay? And yeah, that's basically the building itself finished. And for the rest of this episode, I'm just gonna try and put all kinds of scenery around it to make it fit a bit more in the surrounding area. Something that I think is also worth pointing out is I've done quite a bit of off-camera stuff as well, and I say quite a bit, but I mostly spent a lot of time rotating my camera and not actually placing anything. I know a lot of other people are guilty of doing this as well, but I definitely spent half of my time in Planet Coaster just moving around the park and moving the camera around and not doing anything. But this time it was actually kind of productive, because every few minutes or so, or even less often, I was placing down trees, just because I felt that the park in general didn't have enough trees, and I wanted to be a bit more foresty, while at the same time keeping all of the important sight lines intact. So this process was really one of placing down a tree and then looking at it from every single angle to see if it breaks any sight lines and if it looks good, and if it's okay, moving on to the next tree, etc. Which can be a super time-consuming thing to do. But to me it just adds so much. Foliage is really important to make things look good on one hand, but on the other hand you also don't want the foliage to block the views of the things that you've built. So trying to find a balance between that, I think, is something that you should be able to spend quite a bit of time on if you want to try and perfect the foliage in the park. Because yeah, it can be very time consuming, but it's also quite rewarding, and it can really make your buildings look much better and make the park come together. Anyway, moving back to what I'm actually building here. This wooden bridge is also very pointless. You know, you could have easily just walked around the pond, but I'm going Bear Grylls on this. You know how Bear Grylls, whenever he finds a lake, he has to cross it in the most obscenely ridiculous way possible? He's just trying to show off survival skills, and in this case I'm just trying to show off the scenery. So we are walking over this little pond just because it looks better, okay? I think there's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's something that actually in real life a lot of gardens will do. It's just part of the landscape, and it's also part of trying to create a bit of a miniature Alpine landscape on a very small scale in this queue line to make for kind of a mini natural area. Kind of like a Japanese garden does sometimes. I really like that idea of emulating larger natural structures like mountains and forests and lakes on a very small scale in gardens, because, I don't know, that's really what makes gardens what they are and what makes them so cool, that you can enjoy a natural landscape but on a very small scale. And yeah, that is basically all there is to it. I'm just adding these lanterns and adding some custom fences here and there to give it a bit of a more personal flair than the queue lines in-game would have with their standard railings. But aside from that, there really isn't too much to it, and I'm not symbolically placing down any rocks to represent mountains or any bushes to represent forests directly in a way that Japanese gardens would do, for instance. I'm mostly just imitating these alpine landscapes with a lot of rocks scattered about and flowers between them, as you might see in very high altitudes in the mountains. Which is absolutely gorgeous. Like, honestly, there are sometimes these areas on mountains where there's just rocks scattered about everywhere and all of these rare flowers that you only find at these heights everywhere. It's super cool. It's something I could barely even try to emulate in Planet Coaster, but it's the kind of feeling that I'm sort of going for with this area in the queue line. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with it, especially the ground shrubbery is quite good. Although in hindsight, I really moved the park border really close to this garden. Something which I'm trying to do with Jägerhorn to make it feel like it could be part of a real-life theme park is establish very hard and straight borders on the outskirts of the park, which, I don't know, is kind of a limitation that I'm giving myself, because it forces you to be more creative with how you approach the edge of the park, but it's also in an attempt to make it seem as though it could be part of a real park, because where those borders are would be in real life where another themed area would be, or where some backstage areas would be. I definitely want to get into some kind of backstage areas for this park. So I think it's quite important to nail that Disney feeling, but at times I also feel like I put the borders maybe a bit too close to the park. Like, it's really difficult to make things look good if you really have to obviously place a very, very vertical tree line to block the line of sight to what would otherwise be backstage areas or empty grassy plains. But you know, that's part of the challenge, and it's interesting to try and make forests look as diverse and dense as possible, when in reality it's just a single tree line that's meant to make you not see what's behind it. It's something that in real life I'm also always really fascinated by in theme parks. But yeah, that is basically it for this episode. So I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'll leave you with some cinematic overviews of this ride. And just as a reminder, if you want to donate to Stichting Opkikker, and if you want to support Joey in his stupid, ridiculous quest to ride Condor for 20 hours in a row, you can find the links to that in the description as well. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode, which will hopefully be a bit sooner than usually, because it's going to be summer vacation from now on, so I'll have some more time. Yay.